Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Welcome to Tag Tuesday. Today I want to answer the prompts for what looks like it might be quite a long series of alphabet tags put together by Jim of Jim's Books, Reading, and Stuff. Jim was kind enough to tag me in his debut entry, the A tag. Let's get to the prompts. First, A is for America. What do you consider the great American novel? Over lunch, I had a long conversation with my spouse, David, about what we think and what other people have thought in the past are essential features a book must have to be considered a great American novel. We agreed that anything called the great American novel needs to somehow represent the American spirit, but neither of us were sure exactly what constitutes the American spirit. The United States is a large country with a very diverse population in terms of ethnic identity and regional difference, etc., etc. The so-called American spirit differs tremendously depending on who you ask, which brings up an obvious point. One of the key parts of what it is to be an American is to live in a place of constant cultural contact with people we don't necessarily see as part of our immediate family culture. One of the other things David and I agreed on is the fact that a huge number of books commonly named as contenders for the great American novel were written by straight white men. White men can write great books, but they aren't the only people who can see what is at the heart of America. And in fact, white male authors are not infrequently a bit blinkered when it comes to thinking about the lives of the significant majority of Americans. So then we started thinking about what that phrase, a great American novel, actually means. The last two words seem relatively straightforward, although of course there are questions about what the line is between novella and novel, and what does it mean to be an American? Does it mean the author was born here? Is a citizen here? What if the author would clearly be identified as an American by everyone, but is writing a book partially or fully about another country or place? So there are questions, but the more complicated adjective is not American, but great. Does great only refer to a book's quality? Great book, 5 stars. Or does it refer to length? Maybe great rules out anything compact in page count or style. And then we stumbled across the fact that we thought something called a great American novel ought to talk about something larger than an individual. Well, even larger than a specific region. If a book is too concerned with the interiority of a particular character, perhaps that wouldn't qualify. Similarly, if the book is intensely rooted in a particular region, asking questions that really are about that particular region alone, could that be called a great American novel? Could Faulkner's The Sound of the Fury ever make sense as a choice, for example? We weren't sure. But books that are broader, that talk about more than one region, as John Steinbeck novels often do, for example, or at least talk about more universally human questions, seem to be a better fit for the great American novel label. In other words, the expansiveness of the subjects in a book seems to matter here. And any real contender needs to be something we think will last over generations, at least in some major way, even if we later have rethought portrayals of race or gender or whatever as time goes by. Anyway, at least for the purposes of this prompt, I'll choose 2 books, both written by women and both discussing race. For me, it's hard to see any book that doesn't acknowledge the complications of race and the American experience in the past and in the present as a great American novel. It might be done overtly or subtly, but to me, race is central to the country's development and to its identity. So my choices are Harper Lee's novel To Kill a Mockingbird and Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye. The two address a series of questions that I think make them deeply American as well as deeply human. Both present young and innocent or even naive characters who were shocked into maturity, partly because of the intensity of racial discrimination and the impact of class on those around them. I've talked about The Bluest Eye in much more detail before on my channel, and I'll link to that video down in the show notes. I think I will be rereading Harper Lee sometime this summer, and assuming that happens, you'll be hearing a lot more about that then too. Well, that was a long and somewhat tangential digression. But back to the tag. The second prompt is A is for arc. Which character in literature has the most interesting character arc? Interesting question. I'm going to choose a character in a social history biography I read last year, Rebel Cinderella, From Rags to Riches to Radical, an account of Rose Pastor Stokes, written by the very thoughtful writer Adam Hochschild. I'll leave a link to my written review down below. The title here feels not only incorrect, but fairly sexist, which is really unfortunate. Rose Pastor Stokes transformed over the course of her life from an early 20th century impoverished Jewish refugee to the wife of James Graham Phelps Stokes, one of America's wealthiest patricians. Instead of merely becoming a princess, though, Rose Pastor Stokes used her elevated position to become an important national activist for progressive causes, from the labor movement to the quest for the legalization of birth control, from socialism to more radical approaches, even when her wealthy husband disapproved. But even before she met Graham, she was an independent woman, fighting for the lives of immigrant workers. In later years, she was willing to sacrifice not only her reputation, but her financial standing and even her marriage in order to speak out against injustice. Pastor Stokes' character arc is so extreme that I'm not sure I would find it at all believable in a novel. Question 3. A is for Australia. What was the last book you read by an Australian author? I think the last book I read written by an Australian writer was a Carrie Greenwood mystery featuring Phryne Fisher. I like but don't love the books. Perhaps because I fell in love with the screen adaptations before I picked one up, I'm still a bit disappointed when the books are not exactly what I already love. Perhaps I will in the future. Listening to Sarah at Hardcover Hearts talk about Phryne Fisher always makes me want to give the books another try. There are also 2 Australian authors who might be appearing on upcoming TBRs. One is Tim Winton, whose book Island Home is calling to me right now. I'm also thinking about reading Oscar and Lucinda by Australian author Peter Carey, if Jason at Old Blues Chapter and Verse does in fact lead a read-along this fall, and if I can fit it into my schedule. To be honest, my reading schedule is often crammed these days with forthcoming books I'm hoping to review for publication, so I'm not absolutely promising that I'll be able to join in this time. Still, reading the book with Jason, who knows the book very well, might be an excellent way in. The next question is A is for Austen. What do you plan to read for Jane Austen July? I will be making an official TBR for the month sometime soon, but I'm pretty sure I'll be reading Sense and Sensibility. Although I haven't read it in a while, I'm really excited to look at it again, especially after reading Austen Years, a memoir in 5 novels. Rachel Cohen's book talks about almost all of Jane Austen's novels, but the depth with which she approaches Sense and Sensibility, as a book talking partially about grief, really impressed me. Jane Austen July is one of my favorite theme months on BookTube, and I'm really looking forward to revisiting some Austen and perhaps to reading some newer books about Austen or related topics. If any of you are thinking about your TBRs for the month, I'd love to hear what you're most excited about picking up. Prompt number 5. A is for automobile. What is your favorite literary automobile? These aren't exactly literary automobiles, but I'll name a few literary works that feature automobiles. The first is the fantastic Flannery O'Connor story, A Good Man is Hard to Find. Basically, a family takes a car trip to a nearby state, and let's just say things don't go very well. I read it aloud on this channel and noticed the other day that that video now has more than 3,500 views. Apparently, a couple of teachers have assigned my reading to their students, and I would guess that the PBS documentary about Flannery O'Connor also encouraged people to wade through YouTube. That's kind of cool. Another literary work that relies on a car ride gone wrong is Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. And the third book I will mention is Jesmyn Ward's beautiful Sing, Unburied Sing, where a car ride is the time that much of the central plot unfolds. Jesmyn Ward is, in my opinion, one of the best contemporary American writers out there. I'm looking forward to whatever she writes next, and I fully expect her to dominate literary awards at some point, too. The sixth question. A is for anonymous. What is your favorite book or poem published anonymously? The most recent book written anonymously, which I've read, is the autobiography of Duchess Goldblatt, an elderly and fictional sage that dispenses funny wisdom on Twitter. I'll leave a link to my written review down below. It is quite a charming book. Nothing terribly important or anything like that, but sweet. As for a favorite work that was published anonymously, I suppose Gilgamesh or Beowulf, the Hebrew Bible, are all up there. Perhaps they shouldn't count, since they're all very possibly works that were pieced together over time by many different authors, almost like folk tales. Would that still count as anonymous? Prompt 7. A is for autobiography. What was the last autobiography you read? I recently read Michael Korda's memoir, Passing. It really isn't an autobiography, I suppose, although I still am not sure exactly what the distinction is between autobiography and memoir sometimes. Autobiographies often cover the whole of someone's life, while memoirs focus either on a particular time period or at least a particular theme across time. In addition, memoirs are often a bit more introspective. On all counts, Korda's book is definitely a memoir. Korda was the former editor-in-chief of Simon & Schuster, but this book is tightly focused on the death of his wife from metastatic melanoma when she was in her early 80s. I'll talk a bit more about the book in some future video. And finally, question 8. A is for audiobooks. Do you consider listening to an audiobook as reading? No, but that doesn't mean I don't have respect for listening to audiobooks. A year ago or so, I very rarely listened to audiobooks when we weren't in the midst of a long drive somewhere. I have so many great memories of books my husband and I listened to in the car over the years. This year, I've started listening to audiobooks a bit more when I'm alone, usually nonfiction books, which for whatever reason I find easier to pay attention to on audiobook than fiction, and less irritating as well. I suspect I get annoyed when someone starts making characters sound like something I don't think they should sound like, or whatever. Steve Donahue's pointed out that recording an audiobook is an interpretation of what the author wrote. And that means we as readers can't approach it directly as we do when we read a book. That is, read a book with our eyes or fingers on the page. I think that might be why audiobooks always seem to keep me at a remove from the kind of deep and immersive love I often feel when I read novels. I won't go as far as Steve and say that audiobooks are a bad thing for everyone, but I know my own ability to think critically or even to love deeply is far less developed when I listen to an audiobook than it is when I am directly looking at the text. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for creating this great set of prompts, Jim, and for tagging me. I'm looking forward to answering some of the future alphabet questions as the year goes along. And thanks to all of you for joining me here today on Hannah's Books. See you soon.